Hello everybody. Welcome to the introductory video lecture on the topic of the so-called school of thought of post-structuralism. Today I'm faced with the uneasy task of shortly introducing matters shrouded in a lot of mystery, myth and controversy. Still, I'm excited to hopefully demystify this strain of critical theory and to put the three thinkers I will talk about today into understandable perspective of our fields of literary and cultural studies. The readings I have chosen for today are Jacques Derrida's 1966 lecture Structure, Sign and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences, excerpts from Michel Foucault's 1975 book Discipline and Punish, and a short essay by Gilles Deleuze titled Postscript on the Societies of Control from 1999. My primary aim is to confront you with these texts by Derrida, Foucault and Deleuze as, in my opinion, exemplary introductions not necessarily to the thinkers themselves, but rather to the critical project we call post-structuralism, in which these authors played a major part. My primary aim is to show how this critical theory relates to our own fields of literary and cultural studies. As this is an introductory lecture, I intend to avoid introducing Derrida, Foucault and Deleuze from a philosophical point of view, as that could easily be a whole course on its own. What I rather intend to do is to give you a fair chance at understanding the significance of their propositions to our fields. But I also plan to make some general propositions about the overarching project of Derrida, Foucault, Deleuze, Deconstruction, and post-structuralism in general. Before I go into any specifics, I would like to make one thing very clear. I would like to propose that post-structuralism does not equal postmodernism. While the thinkers and scholars we can bundle under the moniker of post-structuralism worked at the time when postmodernism was also doing its work, we should perhaps think about the distinction in the following manner. Postmodernism is a way of production and consumption of culture in its broadest sense, while post-structuralism provides a theoretical proposition for thinking about a way in which culture is produced and consumed. There is, however, a certain alliance between postmodernism and post-structuralism in their stance against so-called grand narratives, a term that François Lyotard gave us in his The Postmodern Condition. Both post-structuralism and postmodernism share a goal to destabilize and rethink grand narratives, to produce and consume differently, or to draw attention to how they work and how they are constructed, to become suspicious of them, and to investigate and scrutinize them. The standard generalization of the post-structuralist project is that it is a critique of structuralism. The post, therefore, is not to be understood only as after, it rather marks the way in which post-structuralism attempts to emerge from structuralism, to address its proposed limitations, and to readdress topics such as structure itself. And today we are going to very much focus on the issue of structure, but also that which Derrida calls structurality, this quality of the structure, what it does and how it comes about. I will start from Deconstruction and from Derrida. Please note that talking about Derrida merely serves the purpose of introduction to a field of deconstructive criticism, which is varied and complex and goes well beyond Derrida. For those of you interested in a wider context, I have provided a chapter by Richard Rorty, simply titled Deconstruction, which discusses other figures and approaches in deconstructive criticism. This text will not be examined, it is provided as a recommended and advanced reading. Today we will focus on Derrida and his lecture, Structure, Sign and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences, delivered at a structuralist conference at Johns Hopkins University in October of 1966. Now, this paper is widely accepted as the beginning of the formation of American academic interest in post-structuralism. Yale University later certainly played a major role in the development of deconstructive criticism in the context of literary studies. So there is a tradition of deconstructive criticism after Derrida's lecture that emerged. It is due to this significance of Derrida's lecture why I decided to assign you not the version published later in Writing and Difference, but rather a revised version of Derrida's lecture itself. But in order to start talking about post-structuralism and its aim of rethinking the issue of structure and structurality in Derrida, let me first identify a structure which we should all, as philologists, find as a comfortable starting point. One of the central concepts that Derrida addresses in his critique of structuralism is Ferdinand de Saussure's theory of signs. For us, de Saussure is going to serve as the foundation upon which we can start uncovering our common ground, as we all should know de Saussure's theory of signs, put forth in the 1916 book Course in General Linguistics, which is one of the major foundations of the theory of semiotics, the linguistic theory of signs and signification. In a nutshell, de Saussure says that every sign consists of two associated components: the signified and signifier, the concept and the vehicle, or that which is referred to and the way of referring itself. This relation is, first and foremost, arbitrary and based on convention. And this is not something which de Saussure would have been unaware of. He points this out himself. But he also further complicates things when he proposes that the linguistic sign is arbitrary. Language, as defined, would therefore seem to be a system which, because it depends solely on a relational principle, is free and can be organized at will. Its social nature, considered independently, does not definitely rule out this viewpoint. Doubtless, it is not on a purely logical basis that group psychology operates. One must consider everything that deflects reason in actual contacts between individuals. But the thing which keeps language from being a simple convention that can be modified at a whim of interested parties is not its social nature. It is rather the action of time combined with the social force. If time is left out, the linguistic facts are incomplete and no conclusion is possible. Language is, therefore, not simply convention, it seems to be almost referred to as a historical force. It almost seems as though de Saussure was then proposing language as a means to an end, as a self-legitimizing principle, when it works in time. The question of arbitrariness is, however, still a question. How does de Saussure reconcile this issue? For him, the reconciliation lies in a motivation to consider the value of signs in relation to other signs as a measure of their appropriate use, so to speak. This is in a way de Saussure's answer to the irreconcilability of arbitrariness. Signs' difference from other signs, the difference of the thing they refer to mirrored by the difference of the word we use to refer to the thing. See what he has to say and what schema of linguistic value he proposes. Language is a system of interdependent terms in which the value of each term results solely from the simultaneous presence of the others, as in the diagram. This is precisely what Derrida highlights as a problematic notion. To Derrida, this notion that a reliability of meaning and sense can be based only on the differential relations of signs is a big issue. If signs are to be recognized and used based on their difference from other signs, this creates a hypercomplex web of differentiation. Each sign is, then, compared to each other sign to infinity and beyond. There is, however, a tradition in Western philosophy and science which tends to ignore or forget this, instead proposing a center around which meaning is constructed. This tradition, which Derrida criticizes, is called logocentrism. It's concerned with a centrality of logos, that is, words and language, as well as sense and meaning, as a fundamental reality, a deeply metaphysical basis of order of knowledge. Logocentrism is one of the positions against which Derrida launches his whole critical project. His critique was greatly expanded upon a year later in one of Derrida's notorious works of grammatology, but Structure, Sign, and Play presents an early preparation of Derrida's critique of logocentrism, which Derrida hints to in the beginning of Structure, Sign, and Play when he writes, "The function of this center was not only to orient, balance, and organize the structure. One cannot, in fact, conceive of an unorganized structure, but above all to make sure that the organizing principle of the structure would limit what we might call the free play of the structure." I would argue that the critique of logocentrism, this center that he talks about, is the basis of Derrida's whole career, as well as the basis of the theory of deconstruction we have appropriated for literary studies. So what is deconstruction? Let me start with a hypothetical anecdote. I offer this anecdote illustrating what deconstruction is and what it does and what is it concerned with to Professor Jacques from University of Katowice. Imagine there is a big cycling championship held in Australia. And as it happens with sporting events, there are people who travel to see it in order to show their support to the athletes. Imagine that after the race, a Polish guy meets an Australian guy and they get talking. They have a couple drinks and it somehow happens that they end up sitting with a guitar and playing their traditional folk songs to each other. At that point, the Polish guy plays and sings a traditional Polish song called The Green Ukraine, sang from the point of view of a young soldier contemplating death in war and saying that when he dies, he wants to be buried back home. Home being Green Ukraine, historically the Russian Far East. The Australian guy is taken aback by the beautiful melody and the emotion with which the Polish guy plays and sings the song and asks, "What's the song about?" And the Polish guy tries to translate the gist of the song and says, it's about this soldier who says that when he dies he wants to be buried on the Green Ukraine. And the Australian guy says to himself, "Wow, I never had any idea that the Polish were so much into cycling." Why did he think that? It's simple. Ukraine, or Ukraina more precisely, was a renowned brand of bicycles. And it's not so crazy to think that a bike could be green. Here's a green Ukraina for you. So the Australian guy may think that the Polish soldier from the song wants to be buried on his bike. It is in the context of the cycling championship that the Australian's mind goes to this association with the bike brand. And while this is a misunderstanding, it shows one thing, which is one of the bases of deconstructive theory. That language itself can betray intentions of communication because it is open to various ways of understanding or misunderstanding. If you need more examples, think about the way in which people can imagine very different things when they hear or read the words dog or cat. Think about how today they can really imagine such a wide range of dogs and cats, but also think about how some time ago shepherds would only probably hardly imagine any other dog than a shepherding breed, or how at some point no one from the Central Europe could have imagined a Siamese cat. Miscommunication, therefore, happens outside of intention of the interlocutors. In de Saussurian terms, it is brought by a simple mismatch of the values of signs and their constitution through the correspondence of the signified and the signifier. It does not happen outside of context of language itself, since this context influences the way in which we make associations and in which we form our relation of signifier and signified, or choose signs according to their value. And for Derrida, this context of language itself highlights the issue of language as decentered. How are we ever to rightfully and with certainty suppose what size or color is the dog or a cat somebody else is referring to? This lack of center, therefore, of possibility, of decisive signification and a structure, is key. The realization is explicitly marked by Derrida as an important moment. This moment of thinking there is no center was that in which language invaded the universal problematic, that in which, in the absence of a center of origin, everything became discourse, provided we can agree on this word. That is to say, when everything became a system where the central signified, the original or transcendental signified, is never absolutely present outside of a system of differences. The absence of the transcendental signified extends the domain and the interplay of signification ad infinitum. Derrida questions how we can propose a structure if we can find no center. In his words, no central signified, the original or transcendental signified, which would serve as a solid center for the comparison and for the construction of a structure. If we follow Derrida's thinking, we must consider that every time somebody proposes a structure, it is then tied to a proposition of a center, which decisively forgets the fact that signification is, in two words, a big mess. Consider how much this is highlighted in our everyday practice of communication, which is, rather than an extraction of sense and meaning, a process of constant interpretation and misinterpretation. It is for this reason why Derrida refers to Claude Lévi-Strauss's anthropological writings, in which Derrida highlights the proposition that we are no more than bricoleurs, in translation something like handymen or handywomen, who are left to work with the tools they find. According to Derrida, these tools, language, are kind of chaotic and scattered rather than orderly. As Derrida writes, language bears within itself the necessity of its own critique. And so, instead then structured around the center, Derrida proposes language as a subject of its own constant subversion, which he calls play or free play. The subversion happens through its interplay of various combinations of signs in various contexts, which signify very different meanings from other combinations. It is for this reason that Derrida proposes his critical concept of différance, used first in an essay Cogito and the History of Madness, published in 1963, in English in 1973. This intentional misspelling of difference is Derrida's illustrative coinage, which contains a major thesis of his work, appropriated by the fields of literary criticism or cultural studies as the theory of deconstruction. Derrida's différance joins the de Saussurian proposition of the work of signification carried through difference, with Derrida's proposition that, due to its following inherent decentralization, writing always differs meaning, it deconstructs meaning. In this way, language is, rather than a site of decisive and clear meaning-making, a site of interpretation. For literary studies, Derrida's Structure, Sign and Play is an influential text because of its poignant early implication for deconstruction. Already in this text, we can begin to understand that the deconstructive notion that because there is no center to build upon, there is, therefore, no meaning which in itself, through some inherent quality, takes precedence or stands in a privileged position to other meanings or readings. One of the key notions that deconstructive criticism starts with is that language, and therefore text and discourse produced in language, are sites of contestation of authoritative reading as well as of prescriptive reading. Within the context of literary studies and post-structuralist theory, we find another helpful text that helps us understand this further in Roland Barthes's famous essay Death of the Author. In Death of the Author, Barthes proposes that considering the meaning of a text as a product of the author's intentions constitutes bad practice, as it relies on what already the School of New Criticism called the intentional fallacy. Derrida's proposition can be understood as similarly anti-authoritative because both Derrida and Barthes appeal to the same sensibility, that the meaning lies in the language itself. The meaning is never, therefore, set, because the text is written in a language which, being based on differentiation, always differs clear signification and is therefore always open to interpretation. While some thinkers who thought similarly, including Barthes, proposed that this engenders active reading and active readership which would participate in the meaning-making, Derrida's proposition rather invites the reader to pay attention to how the text takes on meaning already from its internal logic of arrangement of language itself. Now, this might all seem quite intense and dense, but just think about how you can take practically anything I say in this very lecture and question it, submit it to scrutiny and interpretation. Even though there are certain conventions within which you may suppose I'm speaking, you can never be completely sure of whether I understand the same words in the same manner as you do, whether our understanding of the signs, the signifieds and the signifiers that are being transferred between us match. We should, in fact, remain suspicious that I might be using some word in a wrong way because of the fact that English is not my first language. Of course that, in order to be able to communicate, we do not thoroughly scrutinize all of this, not only because we don't have time for that, but also because it would be hard to imagine any possible communication in the language system we actually currently use. And I hope that you are beginning to understand how much our communication might always be a leap of faith, in which we are left only with our belief. For example, the belief that you understand what I mean, and I mean what you understand. It is in his critique of the proposition of a center where Derrida establishes the basis for what we call deconstructive theory or deconstruction. In structure, sign, and play, deconstruction is called free play, which Derrida explains as a disruption of presence, and always an interplay of absence and presence. Having considered Derrida's position, we can read this disruption as a disruption of the illusory presence as center. And we can read the interplay of the proposition of absence of center in the context of the language and the need to propose a presence of a center in order to communicate. Within the context of Western philosophy and science, logocentrism is this proposition of a center. And it is toward the end when Derrida contrasts the structuralist approach built around logocentrism, which he identifies with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, to Friedrich Nietzsche and his proposition for affirmation. In Derrida's own words, as a turning toward the presence, lost or impossible, of the absent origin, this structuralist thematic of broken immediateness is thus the sad, negative, nostalgic, guilty, Rousseauist facet of the thinking of free play, of which the Nietzschean affirmation, the joyous affirmation of the free play of the world and without truth, without origin, offered to an active interpretation, would be the other side. This affirmation then determines the non-center otherwise than a loss of the center. Derrida's own proposals of free play follow in this direction of Nietzschean affirmation, of accepting the chaos of language because it affirms its life and liveliness. Poetically speaking, we could say that the chaos of language reflects the chaos of life and human existence itself. And so, toward the end, Derrida, for one more time, proposes two approaches to interpretation. Two interpretations of interpretation, of structure, of sign, and of free play. The one seeks to decipher, dreams of deciphering, a truth or an origin, which is free from free play and from the order of the sign, and lives like an exile the necessity of interpretation. This first interpretation points to the logocentric tradition, which proposes a center and structure but forgets the play, or rather wishes for it to end and to make things simpler. We should understand this exile as the solitude of the centralized meaning and its barring off from the interplay with other meanings, which is necessary for its liveliness. The other interpretation, which is no longer turned toward the origin, affirms free play and tries to pass beyond man and humanism, the name man being the name of that being which throughout the history of metaphysics or of ontotheology, in other words, through the history of all of his history, has dreamed of full presence, the reassuring foundation, the origin, and the end of the game. The second proposed interpretation, or deconstruction, is therefore not a destruction, but rather an affirmation, productive transformation, an opening of a closed and sealed concept of meaning to interpretation. When proposing these limitations of language and its propensity for play or free play, Derrida never forgets that he is also writing in a language and that his own writing is therefore subject to play or free play as well. This is clear from Structure, Sign, and Play, where he writes, "We have no language, no syntax, and no lexicon, which is alien to this history of Western metaphysics. We cannot utter a single destructive proposition which has not already slipped into the form, the logic, and the implicit postulations of precisely what it seeks to contest. It should be contest." Unlike Jean-Paul Sartre, who spent a large portion of his career explaining what he meant, which people constantly seem to misunderstand and misinterpret, Derrida took a wildly different approach. Because every text already contains language that plays with its own meaning, deconstruction is not quite a method in the sense that you can simply take it and apply it to a text. Rather than a method, deconstruction is a process. And Derrida's writing, as much as any writing, as he would be probably the first to argue, is therefore already deconstructing itself. I want to interject with a word about the difficulty of Derrida. Derrida is notoriously known as a difficult writer, but I would say that this difficulty must be understood as stemming from the position from which he writes. This position is implied already in Structure, Sign and Play, still very much an early text by Derrida. He would continue to write an immensely long list of articles and books which would oftentimes touch on issues already sketched in Structure, Sign and Play, or elaborated a year later in Of Grammatology. But I propose that instead of simply addressing these issues in the language that provides and contains those issues, Derrida instead wrote in a way which was decentered by design. He always wrote around things, and he pressed the reader for critical interpretation. He wrote a lot and therefore provided a lot of tools for the bricoleurs that would read his writing. So I propose that the first difficulty of Derrida is this intentional decentralization of his writing. This is one reason why Derrida is considered to be difficult and why he arguably is difficult to read and to understand, because he intentionally subverts the logocentric presupposition that a thinker provides the reader with a reason, with sense, and thought which would be understood instead of interpreted. I propose a second point closely connected to this first one, which makes Derrida such a fabled, difficult author and to many such an impenetrable enigma. Derrida's writing is filled with humor, with double meanings and double entendres, with intentional wordplay. So when he writes about the play that language is subject to, he's not only saying, "This is what I think," or "This is what I have found." He rather says, "This is what I will do." And his whole body of work is absolutely informed by his awareness of the element of play in language. I would argue that this is pretty hard for us to realize or accept. And this is my third point on trying to illuminate the difficulty of Derrida, which to me stems from the same place in which he finds the issue of former presuppositions of a center, a certain tradition in terms of approaches and employment of language, etc., in Western philosophy and Western science, and the tradition of Western metaphysics in general. For us, this playful Derrida presents an issue which I cannot think of in any other way than an issue of cognitive dissonance. I think we are not quite able to easily accept the notion of a playful philosopher, a playful thinker, or a playful scholar. This all, of course, goes back to De Saussure. What do you imagine when I say philosopher, thinker, or scholar? Do you imagine a serious guy with a beard that sternly looks into infinity? Or do you imagine a guy who's playful, who's playing around with words and with different meanings and different way in which their meaning differs through their employment in certain contexts, or with a certain comical timing in mind, for example? But let me be absolutely clear here. This does not necessarily mean that Derrida did not take his work seriously. To me, this rather means that he took it absolutely seriously in the context of his thinking, in the context of his logic of approaching a text, of approaching language, our thinking, and his position toward our relation to sense and meaning and making sense of something. Derrida's playfulness is Derrida's rigor. It is rigorous with his critique of the tradition of logocentrism. Derrida's critique of logocentrism and the critique of its approach to logos as language and as meaning, as a metaphysical basis of the functioning of reason and thinking, results in a body of work that spans almost 60 years of intense publications and can be characterized at the same time by abstractness and roundaboutness in his manner of writing, but it can also be characterized by constant playfulness with language, which not only discovers new ways of reading things, but is decisively leaving room for interpretation or misinterpretation by Derrida's reader, because it would have already happened even if Derrida did not invite it and play with it. So I propose that a part of the difficulty of Derrida lies in the fact that we are having a hard time accepting that someone so prolific and so notorious could be so playful and so subversively witty. And I propose that accepting this and allowing ourselves to read Derrida as a playful thinker is the way to understanding Derrida and understanding deconstruction, because Derrida's writing is always already deconstruction. So finally, what is deconstruction? And the question, what is deconstruction, is a difficult one. Decisively difficult one almost. It is certainly not a question which Derrida would like to decisively answer. Rather than providing another center by answering this question, he would have written around it and employed it. We can, however, interpret deconstruction as a contestation and dismantling of constructions of meaning-making privilege. We can interpret it as a strategy, breaking up the comforting and pacifying illusions of imposed meanings. It is a practice which very importantly allows us to consider the way in which we read and interpret, in which we are led to read and interpret. It is therefore a practice suited for scrutinizing impositions of illusions and of power upon texts as well as upon readers. And Derrida is certainly not alone in this practice. In this way, I propose that deconstruction belongs under the umbrella of the post-structuralist project, most importantly, the political project that is at play in post-structuralist work. With proposing that, let me therefore move on to our other thinkers for today, Michel Foucault and Gilles Deleuze, thinkers very often called post-structuralist, although they would have, same as Derrida, disliked the moniker very much. Why is that? Because such monikers suggest another center. It is a logocentric strategy which I am myself very much guilty of, as I'm here now talking about these people and identifying them with certain movements, tendencies, and certain agendas. But for me, calling Derrida, Foucault, and Deleuze post-structuralists is a communicational shortcut and an attempt to overcome the issues of deferral of meaning, which Derrida concerned himself with, for example. For me, it is a necessary thing to do to communicate these thoughts to you. Now, on to post-structuralism and politics, or micropolitics, the kind of politics that are not just the grand-scale politics, but also personal or interpersonal politics as proposed by Foucault or Deleuze, among others, in various places in their texts. I will try to use Foucault's and Deleuze's texts, excerpts from Discipline and Punish and Deleuze's reaction to Foucault, in order to attempt to illuminate the micro-political project of post-structuralism. I would like to propose that this post-structuralist micro-political project is something that certainly might concern us, even as literary or cultural scholars, because one of the generalizations we can make about post-structuralism is that it addresses micropolitics we are all very much a part of. And we can already consider this from the point of Derrida's address of the issue of logocentrism. The strategy proposing a center, proposing a structure, and trying to escape the openness of play, which, we could say, unnecessarily complicates the project of transferring knowledge, for example, within the structure of education. I don't know about all of you, but I would say that my experience in high school was mostly very much exemplary of the tradition of logocentrism. My contact with literary analysis was next to none. Instead, it was an experience of being told what books mean, or what the authors meant when they wrote them. This proposition of a center and structure, the structure of meaning of a literary work, makes teaching kind of easier as long as we're concerned with transfer of information, with facts or factuality, as contrasted with play, interplay, or interpretation. In contrast to asking what the literary work means, the post-structuralist approach would rather be concerned with the question, what does the literary work do? It is this performativity which is also the inherent quality of what we could call critical analysis or deconstructive analysis, or in general the whole post-structural project. But perhaps most importantly, what post-structuralism does, Derrida, Foucault, and Deleuze included, is that it tries to answer the question, what do structures and structurality do? For example, Derrida's analysis of structures and structurality of language, and his subsequent critique of logocentrism, also imply micropolitical implications of language. And a post-structuralist critical project could then ask, how do structures and structurality of language influence perceived values? Not only linguistic values this time, but rather sociocultural values, for example, as though reflected in literary works. So, what about other sociocultural structures and their structurality? With that in mind, let's move on to Michel Foucault's book, Discipline and Punish. Simply put, Foucault's Discipline and Punish can be read as a historical analysis of the transformation of the structures of discipline and punishment. In his analysis, he makes some important arguments in the chapter that I assigned you with, at least an excerpt from The Body of the Condemned, that we should first regard punishment as a complex social function, 2, as a political tactic, and 3, that we should see how the history of penal law and the history of the human sciences make the technology of power the very principle both of the humanization of the penal system and of the knowledge of man. Foucault's reading of the development away from what he calls the spectacle of the scaffold, this time when brutal public torture and execution served as an act providing closure to the spectators, focuses on the removal of the body of the condemned away from the public eye. Instead, the body of the condemned is moved to a facility designed for disciplining surveillance, most ideally realized for Foucault through the principle of panopticon, a model of a prison proposed by the thinker of utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham. This structure theoretically allows for constant surveillance of any prisoner from the central watchtower. But what is more important, it instills in the prisoners a sense that they can be watched at any moment without any certainty it is actually happening. This constant possibility of surveillance has an effect no more on the body of the condemned, but rather on their mind and soul, hence Foucault's famous quote that the soul is the prison of the body. And the punishment then is internalized and becomes more of a psychological process rather than a physical one. Although it is unfortunately not in your excerpts, Foucault ends his chapter on panopticism with another famous quote we should entertain. Is it surprising that prisons resemble factories, schools, barracks, hospitals, which all resemble prisons? We should therefore remember that the structure Foucault talks about is certainly not just the structure of a prison. What is then, perhaps more important than the structure itself, is its structurality, the quality the structure has and what performative role it therefore plays. As Foucault proposes, panopticism assures an infinitesimal distribution of the power relations, and disciplines are then techniques for assuring the ordering of human multiplicities. Disciplines then have 3 goals. First, to obtain the exercise of power at the lowest possible cost, and this is idealized in the structure of the panopticon. Remember that Bentham's principle of utilitarianism proposes the greatest amount of utility for the lowest price. Following, the second goal of disciplines is to bring the effects of this social power to their maximum intensity and to extend them as far as possible. And the third is to link this economic growth of power with the output of the apparatuses, educational apparatuses, military, industrial, or medical apparatuses, within which it is exercised. In short, to increase both the docility and the utility of all the elements of the system. Foucault, therefore, points out how the utilitarian structurality of discipline works throughout the society as exercise of power. His use of Bentham's concept of the panopticon, or panopticon, is a very precise interpretation of it as panopticon, the all-seeing eye. I will now use it to explain one of Foucault's famous concepts, power knowledge, decisively developed in his book Following Discipline and Punish, the first volume of history and of sexuality. Now, notice the hyphenation of power and knowledge. This hyphenation ties them together as interrelated, and panopticon is an exemplary structure that shows this. Panopticon engenders power knowledge, because the central spectator is able to survey anybody in the structure. He has the potential for knowledge of all movements and activities, and this construes the power over the surveyed subjects. In effect, the knowledge of the subjects, of the constant possibility of being surveyed, brings the psychological effect of always sensing the power looming above them. The result is discipline, as a site of power extended from the supervisor onto its subjects, and of this power suspected and felt by the subjects. Here I'll shortly interject with Deleuze, with Gilles Deleuze and his Postscript on the Society of Control. Foucault's historical analysis extends to his times and the state of the penal law and system of the 1970s, but Deleuze's short article recontextualizes Foucault's implications of discipline in Deleuze's own current day, past Foucault's death, some 25 years later. Well, not after Foucault's death, some 25 years after the publication of Discipline and Punish, rather. In fact, Deleuze's text is a major contribution to thinking about issues such as discipline, surveillance, and control in the context of the world after the information revolution of the 1990s. For example, in concepts such as digital capitalism or surveillance capitalism. Most simply put, Deleuze focuses on the development in the context of late capitalism in relation to the rise of information technologies and the restructuration of the structures surrounding us. In a way, Deleuze's article is an incredibly prophetic text, which, while preceding the widespread rise of the internet as a public space, presupposes many of the structures we participate in today, such as social media. But as you might notice, he also touches upon issues such as workplace dynamics after the shift of the figure of a supervisor from a distant overseer to a part of the team. To Deleuze, this shift does not engender discipline anymore, it engenders control, a new kind of power knowledge stemming from the supervisor's proximity and proposed illusory relatability, kind of as just another cog in the machine. Now, if we were in the classroom together right now and I went around the class and stood behind you, I would have pointed out how at this very moment I'm exercising power knowledge over you in this simplified panopticon of a classroom. I would be able to see all of you. I could look at any one of you. The discipline which would have been implied would have been your undivided attention to the lecture I'm delivering. My teaching would therefore become an exercise of power over you from my position as a teacher, as a knowing teacher. But if I held the lecture at a pub, drinking beers with you, it would have been a controlling power, due to my proximity and relatability. But here's the strange thing. As the teacher, I'm also always transferring knowledge to you, and this therefore increases your potential to act, your power stemming from this knowledge. What if we read Deleuze similarly, that the computer can also be used both ways, as a tool of control, monitoring, and surveillance, but also as a tool for reception of knowledge and our increase of power? Now, the implications of power knowledge are, of course, immensely complicated, because they deal with an incredibly complex multitude of relations that are formed within society. But I will attempt to simplify it in relation to the context of our studies, both in the field of literary and cultural studies as well as our studies themselves, the process of education. I propose that we must read power, or more specifically power knowledge, not only in a negative sense as a dominating and authoritarian force with negative connotations to the dominated subjects, although this is what Foucault focuses on in your excerpts, this disciplining power that you read about. The following implication is that if the knowledge you yourself receive increases your power to act, it has a positive effect. So, I propose that we need to think about two ways in which we relate to power and power knowledge. One is power knowledge as a force of structuration, as a systemic force which normalizes structures, which attempts to employ itself as a metaphysical foundation of existence. This power knowledge is a site of dominating discipline or control in Foucault or Deleuze, respectively. And as a force which brings about the structuration of structures, such as the society, for example, we can see that in its structurality, its centralization, it has a tendency not only to form a center, but also to move other things to the margin. Second way of perceiving power knowledge is perceiving power knowledge as a force of awareness, of suspicion, of subversion or revolution, and overthrowing the structures. This kind of power knowledge becomes the site of deconstruction, of liberation, or resistance. And let me loop back and say that to me these two different notions of power knowledge mirror Derrida's suggestion about the two relations to interpretation. One would be deconstructive, that employs interpretation as means to open the structure, and the other would be structural, which fears interpretation as too open, too playful, and instead hides from the game behind logocentrism. This is really the reason why I started with Derrida, because our discussion of deconstruction and his critique of logocentric structures can help us understand all of this better. We would see the effects of appropriating power knowledge in the second way as resistance very precisely in literary studies and cultural studies. We would see deconstruction being appropriated in the same way. Post-structuralist approaches, their concern with the issue of structure and structurality, have been instrumental in the emergence of subfields which talk about the negative dominating aspects of power knowledge, or which employed the positive resisting aspects. Without the existence of this post-structuralist project aimed at flow of discourse about power and power knowledge, and their specific manifestations such as logocentrism, centering, and marginalization, we would not today talk about some aspects of queer studies or racial studies, post-colonial studies, or even some developments in feminist studies. And feminist studies are really a good example, especially because there is a strain of feminist studies of literature which has been greatly inspired by Derrida's later proposition of the concept of phallogocentrism. This is Derrida's 1972 portmanteau of phallus and logocentrism, which points out how much of language, and therefore of cultural production, is dominated by phallic imagery, or phallic language, as a force of meaning and sense. How then men are centralized and women marginalized in cultural production. And it is precisely cultural production which is at stake, and the way in which structures and their structurality inform our language, our thinking, and therefore our cultural production as well as consumption. Now, to conclude, I hope that I did an okay job introducing the post-structuralist project and suggesting its importance to us. We can, of course, discuss this in a discussion forum or in comments to this video. What we call the school of post-structuralism has, therefore, immense political implications concerned with the way in which we think, in which we speak, which we read, how we read and think or speak, how we're disciplined, how we're controlled, and how we ourselves invite such domination by participating in these structures or by constituting them ourselves. Whether post-structuralists address their topics from the angle of language or movement of history or representation in works of art or other ways does not really matter. As different as they all are, even Derrida, Foucault, and Deleuze all address domination, and through their work and activity, they participate in illuminating the devious implications and motivations potentially hiding behind structures. They, therefore, actively work against structural domination in inviting our active participation in this scrutiny. As scholars and academics, as intellectuals, but also simply as readers, we are invited to critically think, to interpret, and to be aware of our own ways of approaching sociocultural as well as intellectual life. While thinkers such as Derrida, Foucault, and Deleuze seem sometimes obscure or contrived in the way they write, one of their projects, I propose, is actually for clarity of vision. They invent suspicion, seeing through illusions and appearances, seeing through the facade of structures, of intentions, or of meanings. They invite us to scrutinize the way in which we are ourselves a part of these structures, and they give us, in a way, a better option to sincerely consider our own manner of informed participation in the structures that we are a part of, the academia being only one of them. Thank you for your attention.